off in the first place? Just to review a little bit to make sure you know why we are where we are. What got us off in the first place on discussing the divisions? Remember, we're talking about canonicity, and in particular the Old Testament canon. But what got us off? Maybe you'll remember. What got us off in the first place to looking at these divisions? Well, it was one of those questions that we raised earlier. Are there any connections between canonization and the divisions of the Jewish canon? Now, really the only reason we have to raise that question is because the critics answer that in the affirmative. Yes, there are some connections between the Old Testament canonical process and the three divisions that we see in the Jews' canon. Now, our contention is that, of course, that is false, that there aren't any connections between the Old Testament historical canonical process and these three divisions, or two divisions, or even one division, John 10:34, that we have in the Old Testament. But as in many other things, since this is what is held by so many in the seminaries and so many who are writing the books that people are reading today, then this is what we're having to study. And this is how and why we got off on the divisions of the Old Testament Jewish canon, because the critics hold that there's some connection between that and canonization. And after all, and while we're on it, it's interesting anyway to look at these three divisions and to try to discover historically why we have these three divisions and how these three divisions, or these two divisions like we said last week, how they came about anyway. Because we've used them many times in the past, especially in the OTI class. We refer to the law of the prophets, the writings, many times. So it becomes a little more interesting once you've heard references to this on many occasions to find out some of the background behind these three divisions, why we have the three divisions and what they signify. And we were looking at the references historically that we have to the threefold division and to the twofold division last time. We're not going to go over all that again. That's all in your notes. And then on that basis, we were raising a series of about three questions. We'd gotten into the first one. We're going to go back and start with it because I've got two more answers, or two more proofs to the answer we already gave to the first of those three questions that we had looked at, or at least begun looking at last week. And that first question was, after having looked at these references that we have to two different types of divisions in the canon, in the final analysis, are we not really talking about two different canons, was the question. Are we not talking about two different canons, one with three divisions and another with two divisions? Because remember that some of these references that we have to the threefold division are occurring at the same time that we have references to a twofold division. In other words, if we've got a particular name or a particular way in which the Old Testament has been divided, and a name put upon that, whether it's law, prophets, and writings, law of the prophets, if we have that, then why isn't it standard? Why do we have references to both types of divisions and both at the same time? It would be understandable, and it would be one thing if we had references for several hundred years to a threefold division, and then those references stopped simply because the name changed, and all of a sudden for the years after that, we have references to a twofold division. But we've got these occurring along with each other at the same time. So some people would say, obviously, we've got two different canons. Now, there is a question, and there is a whole subject in itself about two canons, and I looked ahead to see, we won't get to that until we get to the Apocrypha probably, where there's a question concerning an Egyptian and a Palestinian, or really an Alexandrian and a Palestinian canon. What can I say? It's really a different question. It sounds the same because it's a question of two canons. Did the Jews have two canons? Did they have a shorter and a longer canon, an Alexandrian and a Palestinian one? And so that more or less could tie in with what we're saying, because it would sound as though the law, prophets, and the writings would be a longer canon with more material, a longer canon than just the law and the prophets, because you've got a third division added on. That is, unless one simply parallels the other, one of the names happens to be left off, the writings or the psalms or the hymns or the precepts or the writings of the fathers or the others or whatever name was attached to it, that's simply been left off, and therefore we've got parallel canons, in other words, the same canon. Sometimes mentioned as having 3 divisions, sometimes mentioned as having 2 divisions. But that's really another question that we'll get to in the future, but you can make a note of it and remember that it'll somehow tie into this when we get many, many months from now, maybe a year from now, I don't know how long, we get to the discussion of the Egyptian or the Alexandrian versus the Palestinian canon, if there were even 2 at all. Now in Matthew 22 and verse 40, we said that all that's in one of these canons is in the other. And not only all that's in the threefold is in the twofold, that would be one thing. But there, of course, could still be some that the threefold has that the twofold doesn't have. So even more than that, all that's in the twofold canon is also in the threefold canon, and nothing is left out in the twofold canon. Now, the twofold being the law and the prophets reference. In Matthew 22:40, a verse we looked at last time, we can see that the whole Old Testament is being summed up under the twofold name of the law and the prophets. And then the most important text to tie in with this is John 10:34. Do you remember what that said? Jesus is quoting a passage from the Psalms, and he calls that the Jewish law. He says, what does your law say? And it's not from the law or from the prophets, but it's from the writings or from the Psalms. So John 10:34 is a very interesting passage. It would appear as though we could simply call the Old Testament the law. And we wouldn't be talking necessarily about the first 5 books, because obviously here Jesus has reference not to the first 5, but to the book of Psalms, because he's quoting from one of the Psalms. So what we were saying was, if that's true, if you can call the whole Old Testament law and still mean law, prophets, and writings, in other words, everything that's in the law, when you use it in the broad sense of the word, is also in the law, the prophets, and the writings, why can't you add to that and call it the law and the prophets and still be including the writings at the same time? Well, it only makes sense that that can be done, and that is what is being done whenever we have one of those references to the law and the prophets. But 2 other proofs in answering this first question negatively, no, we're not talking about 2 different canons, that I didn't give you before are the following. In the first place, the Dead Sea Scrolls mention the twofold division at least 4 times. One of those books being the Manual of Discipline that we had given you earlier. But the Dead Sea Scrolls, all of the scrolls found there in the collection known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, mention the twofold division at least 4 times, yet in these scrolls we have quotations from all of the writings with the exception of the book of Esther. No reference to the book of Esther has to this day been uncovered in any of the scrolls from the Dead Sea collection. Not that we're not going to find some reference, because some of the manuscripts are so mutilated it takes years, experts working on them, to be able to read some of the material that's in them. But the Dead Sea Scrolls, they don't contain a lot of references to threefold division. As a matter of fact, they don't contain any, but they do contain references, at least 4 of them, to the twofold division. In other words, the law and the prophets, but still they're quoting from all of the writings except the book of Esther. Then another proof, our New Testament, which we know generally refers to the Old Testament 16 times as the law and the prophets, or Moses and the prophets, likewise quotes from most of the Old Testament, including most of the books of the writings. You see, if our New Testament, whenever it said law and prophets, didn't have reference to the writings at all, then why be quoting from them all the time? Psalms and all of these other books are referred to just scores of times in the New Testament. And there are a few books in the writings that aren't quoted in the New Testament, but what some people don't realize is that there are a few books in the prophets, 3 that I remember specifically, 3 books in the prophets that as well are not quoted in the New Testament, but still the New Testament authors just summed it up by saying that this is according to the law and the prophets. But yet some of the prophets were missing from that. So if some of the prophets could be missing, then some of the writings could be missing as well, as far as the New Testament quoting from them. So what we're saying is that whenever the New Testament has reference to the law and the prophets, then it has reference to what we consider our 39 books of the Old Testament. Just because it doesn't mention writings doesn't mean that the New Testament doesn't countenance the writings that are in the Old Testament, because it in fact does. It quotes from it many times. Now another question that we can ask based on this information is, which of these methods of division came first? Did the threefold method of division come first, or was it preceded by the twofold method? Well, with just the scant information that we have, it's really impossible to tell. One thing we do know is that whichever came first, it had to originate somewhere between 400 BC and 200 BC. Now remember, I think I said before, we don't have reference in the Old Testament itself to any type of divisions. There are a couple of interesting passages over in Zechariah, which I think we'll be looking at here under Old Testament canonicity before too long. We don't want to get to those tonight. There are a couple of interesting passages over in Zechariah that do refer to certain categories of books, but it's still not a twofold or a threefold division like we have, because there simply wasn't a division at that time. And since all of these books, the Old Testament books, are closing somewhere around 400 BC, that it has to be between 400 and 200 BC when we'll find the date for the origination of either this threefold or twofold division. Which of those, we don't know. The earliest reference that we have, remember, is the 200 BC reference in the prologue to the book of Ecclesiasticus, which of course is a threefold method of division. Now the question is, does that mean that was necessarily the earliest? Well, there's no way we can tell. That's the earliest reference that we have to any type of division, is a threefold division. Some would assume, well, since that's the earliest reference, that's probably the way they first divided the Old Testament, was on a threefold basis. That may be true, that may not be true, because the twofold division over in our New Testament is much more prevalent and much more frequent, even though we know that at that time a threefold division is also being accepted, Luke 24:44. So you've got them again happening at the same time. We know they're happening at the same time in the New Testament. We see 16 references to either the law and the prophets or Moses and the prophets. 10 of law and the prophets, 6 of Moses and the prophets. But we find one the same time during Jesus' ministry in Luke 24:44 of the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. So there the twofold division is really more prevalent than the threefold. Then we can ask, does that mean that it came earlier than the threefold division? Well, again, we don't know. We do know that from around this 200 BC mark, whenever we find our first division, from 200 BC to AD 400, both of the methods of division are used together. From 200 BC to AD 400, both the threefold and the twofold are both used together. Beginning with around AD 400 and extending all the way up until our day, you primarily see references to a threefold division of the law and the prophets and the writings. Why? Because most everything today is based on the Talmud. And the Talmud is where we find our threefold division, our 5, 8, 11 division of the law, the prophets, and the writings. And most things that are believed today as far as the division of the Old Testament canon, as far as Jewish writings are concerned, are based upon the Talmud, not, of course, based upon our New Testament, because the Jews today don't believe our New Testament. So they're not going to be saying, well, we've got 16 references to twofold division and only 1 to threefold, so let's go with the twofold. They don't believe our New Testament. And it's not in their Old Testament, so they can't base it on that. And so the Jews, of course, base a lot of the things they believe, a lot of the erroneous things as well that they believe, upon some of the fanciful notions that are found within the Talmud. So which of these divisions came first, we don't know. Could we take a guess? Really, we couldn't even take a guess. Because on one hand, you would have this logic. Well, they started with a threefold division, but then to shorten the way you would refer to the Old Testament, they went down to a twofold division. And that makes a lot of sense because that happens. Then on the other hand, you have this logic. Well, the number 2 comes before 3. And so probably they started with the twofold division, and then it grew. Things grow after a while. It grew to the threefold division later. So you've got logic behind both of those beliefs, but we don't have any historical information. So a guess would really be outside of what we would need to do at this time, because we simply don't have any information. So let's move on to the third question that we want to spend most of our time on tonight, because this question does have some information behind it, and this is where we can kind of sum up some of our answers and some of our questions about these three divisions, and that is, upon what principle was the threefold division made, especially in separating the prophets from the writings? Because as we see, the twofold division is the same as the threefold division. The twofold division doesn't give us any problem. We've got two divisions, the law of the prophets. Which books are in the law? 5. Which are in the prophets? All of the others. So that gives us no problem at all. The problem comes when you add the writings on there, and you ask yourself the question, now which books were taken out of the prophets and put in the writings, assuming that you had a twofold division and then went to the threefold method? Which did you extract from the second division and put over in the third? So the question is, upon what basis was the threefold division made, especially in separating the prophets from the writings? And you've got different authors that separate different books in different manners. As we've seen before, the Talmud, in comparison with Josephus, a 5.8.11 and a 5.13.4 division, are just entirely different. Obviously, you've got two different authors, whoever wrote the Talmudic accepted division and then Josephus division. But why the discrepancy there? Why not the same? Well, in the first place, the law, of course, is going to stay the same in all of these, whether you've got your English or whether you've got your Jewish division, be it the Talmudic or be it that of Josephus. This points toward our 5 foundation books in the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And this never changes. But going to the Talmud for a minute, this is what we have. The second division, known as the prophets, contains all of the remaining historical books outside of the law of Moses from the Old Testament, with the exception of Ruth, Esther, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. Now, if it was some type of historical basis, then why do we have this problem right away? That the prophets, according to the Talmud, contain the historical books outside of the law, all of the Old Testament historical books, except Ruth, Esther, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. And also in this division, the prophets, it contains the books of the prophets except Daniel and Lamentations. Now, if you've got your list with you, you want to keep it beside you so you can see which books are left over, because it becomes confusing as we go along on which books are left over, which historical books or which prophetic books were taken. If certain ones were left over, then evidently this is not the reason for the division. What was the reason? What was the basis for the division here? It's obviously not according to some chronological basis where so many of them in this century are going to be put in a certain category, and then so many of them in the next century are going to be separated and put in another category. That's not the basis, because we find a Psalm of Moses, Psalm 90, over there with some of those late writings in the book of Psalms, separated by 400 years, a half millennium, and yet they make it in the same book, though. Now, you have to keep in mind that different authors are giving us different threefold divisions, namely the Talmud and Josephus. Now, there may have even been other divisions, threefold divisions, outside of the Talmud and Josephus. Now, for the moment, we've put aside the twofold division. We're only talking about the threefold division, since we know that has to include everything. But the Talmud's threefold division is not the same as Josephus' division. And as I just said, there is the possibility that there could be other divisions, still a threefold division, but with different books in the second and the third category. than what we have here in the Talmud and in Josephus. What might those be? We don't know, because we don't have any evidence for that. But one of the beliefs that we'll get to here in a moment on what principle was used for the division could point toward the conclusion that another author might have differed to some degree from at least Josephus, since the Talmud would have been 300 years later. So without going into what obviously could not be the answer, such as chronology, there are three possible answers to the question, what's the principle? What's the basis? What's the foundation? What's the thought and the idea behind this threefold division, especially as you are separating the prophets from the writings, putting a certain number of books among the prophets and a certain number in the writings? The first answer is the one we've already looked at, and that's the critical answer. And their answer would be that the principle of separation was the progressive or the developmental canonization theory. Why have the threefold division? What was the principle of the division? Well, their view is that the principle of separation would have been the progressive or the developmental canonization of the Old Testament, which in essence would be a chronological view. But it's really the critical view, and we have to get critical in rather than chronological. Now, we dealt almost with this subject here in a whole message before, so we don't need to come back to that. That's the critical view. Next, the conservative view, proposed by our friend that we have come across many times before, William Henry Green. We've seen him before in the Old Testament. We've seen him before in creation. But scholars do make their rounds, I suppose. That's what they're supposed to be doing. William Henry Green is credited with the generally accepted conservative view. Now, I just took the time to look in some books before coming tonight, before teaching here, and sure enough, just about all of the other ones are holding to William Henry Green's view. We don't believe that it's a scriptural view, and we'll show you why as we go along. His view is the following. In constituting the Hebrew canon, books were classified not according to content, but according to the official status of the author. Now, this sounds real logical. He says the books were placed in these three divisions. You know, all of our attention so far has been directed on, well, what's in that book? What made that particular book not make it into a certain division? Well, it was because it was writing about this subject. And William Henry Green came along saying, no, that's not it at all. It's not the subject material. It's not the content of the book. It's the official status of the author. Whatever the author was determined where his book would be placed. You've got Moses, the author himself, the great leader, the great figure in the Old Testament. His books were placed by themselves because they are known as the law. And what was Moses? The lawgiver. His official status was that of a lawgiver. The books of the prophets were put in that section known as the prophets because the authors of these books were prophets. The writings happens to be an eclectic group because of the eclectic nature of the status of the authors of these books. And so you've got a very ingenious, no one had thought of that before William Henry Green. You've got a very ingenious principle or basis for this division. It was the writer of the book. It wasn't the content of the book. It wasn't, as the critics hold, when the book was written. Did it make it in was the book written by 400 BC, then it can make it into this category, or 200 BC, or 80, 90, it can make it. No, he said it's not according to when the book was written, or what was contained in the book, but who wrote the book. And so he makes a division between the lawgiver, the prophets, and this whole pool of authors. Some of them sang psalms, some of them were kings. There were a whole lot of different things. There was a scribe in their midst, Ezra. There was a governor, Nehemiah. So you see, right away, this makes a whole lot of sense, and it's been accepted by most people. Because you see, when you get to this final category, that's exactly right. These authors weren't all prophets. They were a lot of different things. David was a psalmist, a singer, a king. Solomon was a king. Ecclesiastes, a song, Proverbs, and so forth. Job, he was just a great righteous man. Wasn't a prophet, wasn't a lawgiver. Ezra was a scribe. Nehemiah was a governor. And so we have these books in these divisions because of the author. Now you watch and see if this isn't held by most people, because it is. When I say most people, of course, I don't mean your average Christian. They don't know what you're talking about. But I mean the material that you're supposed to be reading when you come across it. You'll find most of them hold to this because that is a very ingenious view. No one had thought of that before. Now here's kind of what his division would look like then. Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Esther, just abbreviate, Ecclesiastes, and the Psalm. Now you see all these are books in the writings. Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Esther, Ecclesiastes, and the Psalm were not in the division known as the prophets because they were not written by a prophet. We happen to know these authors just like I gave you before. We've got a king, we've got a couple of kings, we've got a righteous man. Esther, we don't know who wrote that, so we couldn't really pass judgment on that, but it probably wasn't a prophet or he would have been an important man. Ecclesiastes, the song, we're back to the king. Ruth and Lamentations, he held, were originally attached to other books. Ruth to Judges, Lamentations to Jeremiah. So even if they were written by prophets, that's okay because they were originally among the prophets. In other words, is what he's saying. One thing that doesn't still answer for us, that's fine and good. That Ruth and Lamentations were originally attached to a prophetic book and therefore at one time evidently were among the prophets, fine and good. But that still doesn't answer how, why, and when did they slip over into the writings. Even if they were attached, and we'll assume that they were, they must have been divided at some time. When did this happen, and why did this happen, and how did they slip over into the writings? And that's something evidently he never thought of because he never answered. Then the only final books we have, Ezra was written by a scribe. Nehemiah was written by a governor. And Chronicles was written by Ezra. We're back to Ezra the scribe now. Now, of these 13 books that we have among the writings, that takes care of 12 of them. Do you see which one is missing? Out of the 13 books, there are 13 books in the writings according to the English division. Daniel. Daniel's the one missing. And this leaves him with one problem. If you'll turn over to Matthew 24 and verse 15. This leaves him with one problem. He's answered all of the other things okay for now, because he tells us who the authors were and shows us what their official status was. It wasn't that of a prophet. And so far he's right in what he's saying. It's just that the conclusion does not seem to be scriptural. Because in the first place he's got a problem with what Jesus said about Daniel in Matthew 24 and verse 15. What does Jesus say? Wherefore, when ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place, then whoso readeth, let him understand. So here we think that we've got him cornered, but we don't, because it's at this place where he makes his celebrated distinction that's been followed by most conservatives since that time between the donum propheticum and the munus propheticum. Two different Latin phrases that refer to, and this is very important because this is how he gets away and gets out of the trap that we caught him in. We could say that Jesus caught him in Matthew 24:15 by calling Daniel a prophet. He makes a celebrated distinction between his donum propheticum and munus propheticum. Donum propheticum simply means the prophetic gift. You can see the words in Latin there that came from the Greek, prophetic gift. Munus propheticum, prophetic office. And he makes a distinction between having the prophetic gift and between having the prophetic office. And so what he would say about Daniel is that Daniel here had the prophetic gift, but not the prophetic office, because if he had the latter, the prophetic office, then his official status would be that of a prophet, and it would ruin William Henry Green's theory. And so most people, for some unbelievable reason, E.J. Young, well-known conservative scholar, is one of the well-known ones that followed right in William Henry Green's tracks, and Charles Ryrie, professor down at Baptist Seminary in Dallas, is another one, and most of the others are other ones that are conservatives, have followed right in this deception of making an unscriptural and unwarranted distinction between an Old Testament prophetic gift and an Old Testament prophetic office.
For the continuation
E.J. Young, well-known conservative scholar, is one of the well-known ones that followed right in William Henry Green's tracks, and Charles Ryrie, professor down at Baptist Seminary in Dallas, is another one, and most of the others are other ones that are conservatives, have followed right in this deception of making an unscriptural and unwarranted distinction between an Old Testament prophetic gift and an Old Testament prophetic office. You see, what I think is that if they would have stayed with the New Testament, they would have seen that it's not until we get to the New Testament that we see a distinction between the prophetic gift and the prophetic office. In the Old Testament, we don't see that distinction. All those who prophesied were prophets. And if you prophesied, you were a prophet, and if you didn't prophesy, then you weren't a prophet. And there you would see there's no distinction, if that's true, between having the gift of prophecy, that's all we're saying, between having the gift of prophecy and having the office of a prophet. But if you'll turn over to 1 Corinthians 14, a chapter, of course, which they don't turn to very often and don't know anything about, being non-charismatic, they wouldn't realize that they've really gotten ahead of themselves. They should have gotten here to the New Testament and seen, here's where we see our donum propheticum and munus propheticum, the difference between one having the gift of prophecy and one having the office of a prophet. Why was that invented in the first place? To explain away Daniel 24:15. Because with that theory, you see, it's a good theory so far, or up until that point of Matthew 24:15, it's a good theory that you're going to make the division based on the author of the book. But when you start going through that section of the writings, all of a sudden you pop up with one of them who you know is a prophet, if you're going to believe what Jesus said, because of Matthew 24:15. Now, maybe the authors of all the other books in the writings weren't prophets. That may well be true, so that's really beside the point now. But you still run up against Daniel as being a prophet, but his book not being in the prophets. And you see, if your contention before that has been that the division is going to be according to the official role in which the author stands, and you find Daniel being a prophet, then you're going to have to make this subtle, unscriptural, unwarranted distinction between having the gift of prophecy and standing in the office of the prophet. And they make this for the Old Testament. And therefore claim that Daniel, the great prophet, was not a prophet after all. He simply had the donum propheticum. He had the prophetic gift. But we don't find this, as I say, into 1 Corinthians 14. 1 Corinthians 14, verse 5, I would that ye all spake with tongues, I would that ye all, but rather that ye all prophesied. So what he's saying here is that ye all can prophesy. So that must mean that either we can all have the donum propheticum or munus propheticum. We can either all, he says, have the prophetic gift or the prophetic office. Which is it? 1 Corinthians 12. And verse 10, gifts of the Spirit, and he says these are given to all, verse 10, the gift of prophecy. So right away we can narrow it down, even if we didn't know a lot about charismatic truth and the gifts of the Spirit. We could narrow it down to the fact that what we can have over there is the donum propheticum. We can all have the prophetic gift. Because in verse 28 of chapter 12, this role of the prophets is something entirely different than the gift of prophecy. And as well, we can see in 1 Corinthians 14, beginning with verse 29. Thus far, throughout chapter 14, he's been talking about the gift of speaking in tongues, the gift of the interpretation of tongues, as well as the gift of prophecy. But now in verse 29, let the prophets speak 2 or 3, and let the other judge. And if anything be revealed to another that sitteth by, then let the first hold his peace. That is, if one is up prophesying and another one has a direct revelation at that moment, then he has the scriptural right to interrupt the one prophesying and prophesy himself. For ye may all prophesy. Now he's back to ye may all. So he's back to the gift now. For ye may all prophesy one by one, that all may learn and all may be comforted. Now he's back to the prophets. But the spirit of the prophets is subject to the prophets. So now he's back to the prophets again. Here we do see this distinction between a gift of prophecy and between the office of a prophet. But you're not going to find any scriptural basis for superimposing this New Testament truth here, or this, we could say, after Pentecost, after the baptism of the Holy Spirit truth, back upon Matthew 24:15. Which, although we find it in the New Testament, it's really Old Testament, because it's talking about Daniel the prophet, the Daniel of the Old Testament. And what they want to do, really they're not trying to do that, but what it ends up, you're superimposing an after Pentecost experience and distinction, 1 Corinthians 12 and 14, back upon the Old Testament prophets by saying some of them were prophets and some of them weren't. Some of them had the gift. But remember, the reason why this distinction had to be invented is only one, and that's because Daniel, being a prophet, according to Matthew 24:15, would be a thorn in the side to this belief, conservative belief, by William Henry Green, that the threefold division is based upon the status of the author. You see, it's a thorn in their side whenever you find that one passage. We could say, praise God, we've got that one passage, because otherwise they'd be off to the races with all of these other books in the writings where they say they weren't written by prophets, and so we'd say, well, we really don't know. But at least here, one time, we do know. And besides that, another thought comes to mind, which I mentioned earlier. What about the 90th Psalm? Now, it was written by someone who was not just donum propheticum, but who was munus propheticum, and that is Moses, the great prophet. And yet he had something that got over in the writings. Now, how are you going to explain that then? Well, they don't try. You know, the things they know they can get away with by explaining, they attempt to. Those they don't know, they just don't mention it and hope the rest of us don't know our Bibles well enough so we know that Moses wrote the 90th Psalm. But there's another thorn in their side. How are you going to explain the 90th Psalm and probably the 91st Psalm as well? Two of them written by munus propheticum, munus Moses propheticum, rather than the one who's just got the simple gift. Well, as I say, most hold to this. Most, even conservative scholars, hold to this distinction. It's unwarranted because it's unscriptural, and it's not necessary. It's only necessary if you hold to William Henry Green's theory, that the division is according to the status of the author. Then it's necessary, because you have to answer for Matthew 24:15. But in saying that it's unwarranted, we mean that not only do you not have to invent this distinction between the gift and the office of prophecy and the prophet, you don't even have to hold to the belief that the division is based upon the status of the author. Why? Because we have a third principle here, a third view that we could accept if we find the critical and the conservative view not acceptable. And this is what I feel it to be, and that's simply a combination of a variety of things. We get in trouble, I would say, when we try to find one particular principle on how and why the divisions and the separations were made between a 5:8:11, a 5:13:4, or really between the two divisions of the prophets and the writings. Whenever you look for one principle, either it's the process of canonization, which is the critical theory and view, or the conservative view that it is the status of the author. If you look for only one thing, you're probably going to be in trouble, because as far as we know, not one single thing, not one thing by itself answers the question on why the division was made. You see, if one thing answered it, that would be okay. But one thing doesn't answer it. This discussion of the status of the author, that sounds fairly good, because we know that for the most part, the books that are in the prophets were written by those that were outstanding and well-known prophets, and prophets who were known for just that, as being prophets. Whereas some of those books over in the writings were written by others who, if they were prophets, which we're not looking at now, weren't known as being a prophet by most people in their official capacity, as was someone like Isaiah. You see what I'm saying? Or Jeremiah. So that has some sense to it. It's just that that's not the only thing that has to be said concerning the division. I said a combination of things, probably the following, I think, 4 things were taken into consideration in this division. Number 1, the character of the book. There's no way you could put Isaiah among the writings. The character of his book is an overtly prophetic character. That was the purpose of his book. Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, the character of their book is not the same as Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. So we're saying that one of the first things taken into consideration in this division, whoever did it, remember, we don't know who first began this. It began somewhere between 400 and 200 BC. When we don't know, by whom we don't know. But one of the things taken into consideration was the character of the book. Those 5 foundation books of the law of Moses had to be separated by themselves. And those books that were written by prophets that were well-known prophets, even Samuel, by Samuel, and Kings, maybe by Jeremiah, written by well-known prophets, were placed among the prophets. But when you get to someone like Solomon, you see, you don't have any of his books among the prophets. The only place you find books by Solomon are among the writings, and this is probably one of the things taken into consideration. Then in the second place, the historical use of the book. The historical use of the book. Let's see, we'll say more about that one in a moment. In the third place, not the official status. We'll phrase it in a different way, the prevailing function of the author. Not the official status, but the prevailing function of the author was probably another thought in the people's minds that made the division. And then last of all, and maybe most importantly, was simply the discretion of the compiler. Why? Because even if these other 3 things were accepted and universal, that still doesn't answer the difference between the Talmud and Josephus. So if we had no other alternative, we could say, we could accept this final view here, or this final reason in the combination of things on why the divisions were made, the discretion of the compiler. The one who compiled the books and gave us some type of an official list. Just because one did it one way doesn't necessarily mean that everyone is going to follow him thereafter. So the character of the book, the historical use of the book, the prevailing function of the book, and not the whim, but the discretion, the thought-out, considered discretion of the one who's compiling this official list for us. Now let's go back to our list then with this in mind, with our 3 divisions here, the 39, 24, and 22 book division, and see exactly how this fits together. Now we've made a distinction between the English division and our first Jewish division, that being the 39 and the 24 book division, because one is a 39 and one is a 24 book division. But maybe I don't want you to overlook, maybe some of you have overlooked what is similar about the 39 book division and the 24 book division. What's similar about them? The number of books is different, 39, 24, greatly different. But what is similar about them? I mean, it's the obvious thing that evidently you've overlooked. What? All the books are in the same division. So the 39 is exactly the same as the 24. It's just some books are combined there. But the books that are in the prophets for our division is also in the 24 division. And the books that are in the writings in our division is also in that division. That's not true with Josephus, though. But you see, probably some of you overlook that. They're really the same thing. It's just that Ezra, Nehemiah, Chronicles, the 12, some things are joined together. But really, we've got the identical same division. It's a threefold division with so many books, whether you're going to do it our way or whether you're going to do it the 5, 8, 11 way, with so many books in the prophets and so many books, and they're the same books, and so many books down in the writings. And they're going to be the same. But when we come to Josephus, then this is where we have our difference. But staying with the Talmud division for a moment, this is basically what the Jewish division is. Let's say the following. Here's what we have on the basis of these combination of things that we've just given you. Among the prophets, we would have the following. We'll give you for both of these, the prophets and the writings, the law not being necessary. Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12. Eight books in this division: Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12. Same as our 21 books. Now go back up to your four things. Character of the book. Well, let's start first of all with prevailing function of the author: Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Isaiah, all of them, obviously written by well-known prophets. Discretion of the compiler, that's where it's going to differ between the Talmud and Josephus. The historical use of the book, that really doesn't play in this particular setting. It will with one particular group of the books. Character of the book, well, obviously Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the 12, the character of the book is certainly prophetic. You can certainly see it if you're looking for it in Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. You can see prophetic character. But remember, we didn't say that all four of these things had to figure in. It's a combination of either three of these reasons or one of these reasons or two or all four. You see, when we're talking now about the particular character of the book, let's take Kings, for example. It's not prophetic in character in the same way that Isaiah and Jeremiah are, but it doesn't have to be, because we're only talking about a combination of these things taken into consideration, and it was upon this basis that this division was made. Now we go to the writings, and here we'll tack on one of these things under the combination that would have probably been in the back of the mind with the books placed here in the writings. Psalms, Proverbs, and Job, placed among the writings probably for three of the purposes. Number one, the use of the book, especially the book of Psalms. It was used differently than some of the other books. The character of the book, all three of these, Psalms, Proverbs, and Job, really fit all three of these conditions: the use, the character, and the prevailing function of the author, being not on the surface that of a prophet, being something different. Then the roll, all five of the books in the roll, Ruth, Esther, Ecclesiastes, the Song and Lamentations. Why placed here? Well, that obviously is the use of the books. That is an obvious reference there, because those books were used on particular feast days. So there was certainly the thought behind the exclusion of the roll from the section known as the prophets. Then that leaves us with Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles, probably due to the function of the author and the character of the book. Now, I'm going to say something else about Daniel here in a moment. We'll come back to Daniel. But for right now, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, Chronicles, the function of the author and the character of the book. Now, if anything was taken into consideration, it was one or more, probably, of these four things that we've just given you. There's really no better answer on why the framers of the Talmud made this 5, 8, 11 division. But now let's go on to the more interesting one, and that is Josephus. And by the way, remember, Josephus' division is 300 years before the Talmud, which will perhaps prove something important in the future. Now, this was supposed to be your homework. You've got 5 books in the law. You've got 13 books in the prophets. You've got 4 in the writings. We already told you that probably 2 books, we told you definitely, 2 books that could be extracted from the writings would be Ruth and Lamentations, because they could easily be attached to other books. But if we did that, then we should end up with a 5, 8, 9 division, because we have subtracted 2 from the 11 division of the Talmud among the writings. We added 2 more to the prophets, but since it's still 2 books instead of 4 books, that's going to keep us with 8, would give us 5, 8, 9. Instead, we have 5, 13, 4. Now, Josephus' division obviously is going to be quite a bit different than the Talmud. So what did you come up with? I guess you realize that there are just a whole lot of different options, because you've got a whole collection of books there to get sorted out in a 13-4 manner. And obviously, when you've got that many books to sort out in a 13-4 manner, they can go in just dozens of different ways. But if you're thinking, and if you have been thinking over the past week as you were figuring that out, only one thing really makes any sense. Anyone have the right answer? Go ahead and say them out if you do. No one does?
Psalms, Proverbs, Job.
Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Daniel, the prophet Daniel in the writings?
Ecclesiastes.
Psalms, Ecclesiastes,
Proverbs.
and
Psalms.
the Song. Now you've got Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, the Song, and the Psalms. You've got those 4 books. That would mean all of the others. That means you're putting Ezra, Nehemiah, and you're putting Chronicles, and Ruth, and Lamentations, and Daniel, and Job. You're putting all those back up among the prophets. Well, go back to the quote that I gave you. That's the only clue that we have. We know that there are 4 books here, and what does he call those 4? Hymns to God. So hymns, there goes the Song and Psalms right there. That gives us 2 books. And what else does he refer to? Precepts for the conduct of right living, on how to live right. You got to get 2 more books. Now, which 2 would it be? Proverbs tells you how to live. Ecclesiastes is written to tell you how to live. Right, very good. Probably that's what we have. We've got these 4 books, Psalms and the Song, which match Josephus' reference to hymns, and Ecclesiastes and Proverbs, which match his reference to precepts of right living and right conduct. That would give us 4 books. Then among the prophets, if you just want to jot them down, that would give us the following. So you'll have it in order. For the prophets, you would have the same 8 as the Talmud, plus the following. Job, Esther, there's another one I didn't mention then, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. So you've got 8 plus these 5, Job, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles, which gives us our 13 that we need. 8 plus the 5 gives us our 13. The writings, we have Psalms and the Song because they're hymns, Proverbs and Ecclesiastes because they're precepts for right living. And it's interesting in Josephus that the only books that made it here into the writings are our books written by Old Testament kings. And that's probably why they're divided themselves, and here we would fit back under that condition of being the prevailing function of the author. That would be at least part of the consideration here under view whenever he's making this division, because these 4 books, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song, happen to be the 4, and the only 4, Old Testament books that were written by a king. And it's interesting that these four happen to end up all together. All the other books are written by different types of authors, prophets, scribes, governors, and so forth. But here you've got two kings, David for the most part, and Solomon. Of course, the only problem with that is you've got some in Psalms written not by David, by people who certainly were prophets. So you can only use this in combination with one of the other things as being why Josephus put these four in this position. Why does he put Job, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles back up in the prophets? Probably because he felt that the authors of those were prophets, which is very interesting. When you consider Job, Esther, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. Daniel, that's no surprise. We know he's a prophet. But it's interesting that this is probably what Josephus is considering. He probably based his threefold division and his 5-13-4 division upon the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and that's why he was trying to get 22 books out of all. Let me hasten to add, that does not mean that he was necessarily trying to reduce the 24-book division, because for all we know, it did not exist at that time. It didn't come along that we know of for 300 years after Josephus. So we've mentioned before that Ruth was taken out and that Lamentations was taken out, but not necessarily to reduce it from 24 to fit 22 for the 22 letters in the alphabet, when maybe there was no such thing as a 24-book division anyway. So in all likelihood, what I'm saying is Josephus' division was the official division. Now this makes a lot more sense when you go to Luke 24:44. A lot more sense, and you see that Jesus referred to the Old Testament as the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. Because in this division that Jesus called the Psalms were only 4 books, basically written by David and his son, David and King Solomon. Now, you probably never thought of that before, but that's probably what Jesus had reference to. We said before we can't be certain which books he included under the Psalms when he said that, but since Josephus is a contemporary with Jesus during the 1st century A.D., and Josephus has these 4 books in that final division, headed up by the great hymn book known as the Psalms, that's probably the accepted division during that day. This, again, is something you won't hear, you won't see in your readings. Everyone believes that the Talmudic division was the official division, and Josephus was an aberration of that. Now, why the Talmud changed, we don't know. We can, again, stick in one of our things there, the discretion of the compilers. For whatever reason, they wanted to change things around a little bit. But this is probably the setup that Jesus had in mind over in Luke 24 and verse 44. Now, in conclusion, this also answers all of those objections about the book of Daniel that we've had in the past on why was Daniel not among the prophets. It answers all those. He was among the prophets. He was always thought to be among the prophets. Josephus considered him among the prophets. You see, it's always been a problem for people because Daniel, who we know is a prophet, never made it into the prophets because we find him in the writings based on the Talmud today. But if our guess on which 4 books fit under the writings according to Josephus' division is correct, then Daniel was indeed among the prophets. And therefore you don't need the developmental theory to say, well, Daniel was written 168 and the prophets had already closed in 200 and that's why he didn't get into the prophets, when in fact he was in the prophets the whole time. Why does no one seem to realize this? Because people skip over this reference of Josephus here and just go on and assume that the Talmud is what always has been correct and has always been official. But if you go back 300 years before that and you get Josephus' account, then this is probably the initial and official way that things were divided, and it solves all of our problems about Daniel the prophet being among the writings. That is modern when we see Daniel among the writings, relatively modern, when in fact, according to Josephus, he's been there all along. So then again, we don't need any distinction between prophetic gift and prophetic office, because he had both the gift and the office, and he made it back in that category. By the way, as we're wrapping up, one thing that I do remember that we've given you before, and that's because we couldn't get off in the area of canonicity in OTI. Do you remember what our suggestion was? And this suggestion is certainly a good suggestion. It would only be true as far as the Talmud is concerned and not Josephus. But what was our suggestion that we gave you before concerning why The conservative suggestion, not because it was written 168, but the conservative suggestion on why was Daniel's book placed among the writings and not among the prophets.
Historical?
Okay, that's pretty much it. We told you before when we studied Daniel that the Old Testament prophets really had two functions. They were to be predictors of the future as well as preachers of righteousness. And one thing Daniel is not doing, he's not a preacher of righteousness laboring among his people like Isaiah and Jeremiah preaching for them to turn from their sins. So he has a little bit different ministry. It does not mean that he's not a prophet, but it means that the function of his ministry is going to change at different times. He is a prophet in that he is certainly predicting future events, but he also is a great statesman in the court of Babylon. So if that's a consideration at all, it would fit for the compiler of the Talmud and not for Josephus. Josephus didn't have to worry about why he was among the writings because Josephus says, I'm going to put him among the prophets.
For a